The twin suns burned high above the cracked, orange sands of Calthor, a forgotten planet on the galaxy's edge. Jackson Teller adjusted his worn leather jacket, squinting through the heat haze at the rusty hull of his ship, the Drifter. He'd landed here chasing a debt, 20,000 credits owed by an old alien trader named Vorm. The port authorities back on Nexus Station had locked his ship until he paid his own fees, and this was his last shot to get back in the black. His boots crunched against the ground as he checked his wrist pad. Vorm, 20,000 credits, overdue 6 months. Simple enough, he thought. Get the money, get out. The spaceport was a mess of noise and dust, hulking cargo drones buzzed overhead, merchants shouted about cheap fuel, and a three-eyed bartender slung glowing drinks to spacers. Jackson pushed through the crowd, his dark hair plastered with sweat. He wasn't here to haggle or drink. He needed credits, and Vorm was his ticket. You seen an old trader named Vorm? He asked a passing mechanic, a lanky alien with too many arms. The mechanic pointed a greasy claw toward a crumbling shack on the outpost's edge. That's his hole. Good luck, old guy's tricky. Jackson approached the shack, a squat building carved into a cliffside. Strange carvings lined the entrance, swirls and jagged lines that didn't match any language he knew. He knocked, and a raspy voice called out, "Enter, human." Inside, the air was cool and thick with the smell of burnt herbs. Vorm stood there, an ancient alien with sagging gray skin and 4 sharp eyes glinting under a tattered hood. His hands fidgeted with a small, glowing orb. Jackson Teller, Vorm said, his voice like gravel. I knew you'd come. Let's skip the chit-chat, Jackson replied, crossing his arms. You owe me 20,000 credits. I'm here to collect. Vorm chuckled, a dry, rattling sound, and waved a hand. Credits? Bah. I have something better. Jackson's gut tightened, debtors who dodged payment always meant trouble. I don't want your junk, he said, eyeing the shelves of odd trinkets behind Vorm. Just the money. But Vorm's grin widened, showing cracked teeth. Not junk, human. Family. Before Jackson could argue, a side door hissed open. A figure stepped out, a young alien woman, tall and striking. Her skin shimmered a faint blue, like the glow of a distant star, and her silver hair flowed like liquid metal. Her eyes, though, were what stopped him, bright yellow, sharp, and burning with anger. This is Lila, Vorm said proudly. My daughter. She's yours now. Debt paid. Jackson blinked, his brain scrambling to catch up. What? Lila's fists clenched, and a faint hum filled the room as tiny sparks danced around her hands. I'm not a thing to trade, father, she snapped, her voice low and dangerous. Vorm ignored her, turning to Jackson. An old custom of my people. A life for a debt. She's strong, worth more than your credits. Jackson stepped back, hands raised. Listen, old man, I don't want a wife or a fight. I want my money. But Vorm was already moving, faster than his frail body suggested. He pressed the orb in his hands, and a loud clank echoed as metal panels slammed shut over the doors and windows. The shack, no, fortress, locked tight. You'll see her value, Vorm said, slipping toward a hidden exit. Stay a while. With a final cackle, he vanished through a hatch that sealed behind him. Jackson lunged, banging on the metal. Hey! Open this up. He turned to Lila, who stood rigid, sparks still flickering around her. He does this, she said bitterly. Thinks he owns me. Jackson rubbed his face, frustration boiling. Great. Trapped with a crazy old man's kid who looks ready to fry me. Lila's eyes narrowed. I could. But I won't, yet. She crossed her arms, studying him. You're not what I expected from a debt collector. Yeah. Well, you're not what I expected for 20,000 credits. Jackson paced, scanning the room for a way out. The walls were solid, the tech ancient but tough. Any ideas how to bust out of here? Lila hesitated, then nodded. Maybe. But you'll have to trust me. Jackson laughed, short and sharp. Trust? Lady, I don't even know you. She stepped closer, sparks fading. Then start now. Or we're both stuck. Outside, the suns dipped lower, casting long shadows through the shack slits. Jackson weighed his options, none good. His ship was out there, impounded credits away, and now he was locked in with a stranger who could spark like a live wire. But something in Lila's gaze, fierce, yet steady, told him she wasn't just Vorm's pawn. Fine, he said. Let's try it your way. She smirked, just a little. Good choice, human. And with that, their unlikely partnership began, one neither of them had signed up for, but one that might just change everything. The air inside Vorm's fortress grew heavy as the twin suns dipped below Calthor's horizon, painting the sealed shack in dim orange light. Jackson Teller banged on the metal hatch Vorm had disappeared through, his knuckles aching from the effort. Come on, you old trickster, he muttered, stepping back to catch his breath. The walls were solid, the tech old but stubborn, no way out without a plan. He glanced at Lila, who stood near a cluttered workbench, her blue skin faintly glowing in the shadows. Sparks still danced around her fingers, though smaller now, like fireflies fading in the dusk. Stop hitting things, Lila said, her voice sharp but calm. It won't open. My father's traps are smarter than that. Jackson wiped sweat from his brow, his dark hair sticking to his forehead. Great. So we're stuck here until he feels like letting us out. Lila's yellow eyes flicked to him, unreadable. Not if I can help it. She turned to the workbench, pushing aside dusty tools and strange, humming gadgets. He thinks he controls me, but I've been watching him for years. Jackson raised an eyebrow, leaning against the wall. Watching him? What, you're some kind of rebel daughter? Lila didn't answer right away. Her hands moved fast, pulling apart a small device, a tangle of wires and a glowing crystal. Something like that, she said finally. He's kept me here since I was a kid, saying it's for my safety. But I've learned a few tricks. She held up the crystal, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. This powers his locks. If we break it, we might get out. Might? Jackson crossed his arms. I don't like might. I like will. Lila smirked, a flicker of amusement in her fierce gaze. Then help me, human, and we'll make it will. Jackson hesitated, then stepped closer. He wasn't an engineer, but he patched the drifter through enough scrapes to know a thing or two. All right. What's the plan? She pointed to a panel on the wall, its edges glowing faintly. That's the control hub. If we overload it with this crystal's energy, it could fry the system. Could, he echoed, grinning despite himself. You're full of promises. Lila shot him a look, but her lips twitched. You're full of complaints. Grab that wire. Jackson did as she asked, pulling a thick cable from the workbench while she tinkered with the crystal. They worked in tense silence, the hum of the fortress's systems filling the air. Every now and then, their hands brushed, hers cool and sparking, his rough from years of piloting. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. As they rigged the crystal to the panel, Lila spoke again, quieter this time. He wasn't always like this, you know. My father. He used to trade across the stars, big deals, big dreams. Then something changed. He got scared, locked us away here. Said the galaxy wasn't safe for me. Jackson glanced at her, curious. Safe from what? She shook her head, silver hair catching the light. I don't know. He never told me. Just started collecting debts and making enemies, like you. Enemies, huh? I just want my credits, Jackson said, twisting the wire into place. No offense, but you're not my type of payment. Lila laughed, a short, bright sound that surprised him. Good. I'd hate to be owned by anyone, especially a scruffy pilot. He chuckled, shaking his head. Scruffy? Ouch. I've got charm, you know. She didn't reply, but her eyes softened for a moment before she focused back on the panel. Ready, she said, holding the crystal over the hub. This might get loud. Jackson braced himself. Do it. She pressed the crystal down, and a surge of energy shot through the wires. Sparks flew, the room lit up in wild flashes, and a deep groan rumbled from the walls. The panel smoked, then sparked again, but the hatch didn't budge. Well, that was exciting, Jackson said, coughing through the haze. And useless. Lila frowned, pulling the crystal back. It should have worked. Unless, she trailed off, her gaze snapping to the ceiling. A faint whirring sound grew louder, and Jackson followed her stare. A hidden vent slid open, and a small drone dropped down, its red eye glowing. Intruders detected, it droned in a flat voice. Containment protocol active. Before Jackson could react, it fired a net of crackling energy, pinning him to the floor. He grunted, struggling as the shocks bit into his skin. Lila moved fast. She thrust her hands forward, and a burst of sparks shot from her fingers, slamming into the drone. It sparked, spun, and crashed in a heap of metal. The net fizzled out, freeing Jackson. He rolled to his feet, panting. Nice shot. What are you? Lila's chest heaved, her glow brighter now. I don't know, she admitted. It started years ago. Father said it's why he hides me. But I've never used it like that before. Jackson stared at her, the pieces clicking. So he didn't just trap me here for a debt. He wanted you locked up too. Lila nodded, her jaw tight. He's afraid of me, of what I could do out there. She looked at the wrecked drone, then at him. We're not waiting for him to come back. Help me find another way. Jackson rubbed his stinging arms, meeting her fierce gaze. Deal. But when we get out, I'm still getting my credits, one way or another. The fortress creaked around them, as if alive and watching. Outside, the desert wind howled, a reminder of the world beyond their prison. Jackson didn't know what Lila was, or what Vorm was hiding, but he knew one thing, they weren't staying trapped. Together, they turned back to the workbench, searching for answers in the tangle of tech and secrets. The pilot and the spark wielder, bound by a debt neither wanted, were about to rewrite their story, one daring move at a time. The desert night stretched endlessly outside Vorm's fortress, the twin moons of Calthor casting pale light through the narrow slits in the walls. Jackson Teller sat on the dusty floor, his back against a crate, tinkering with a busted scanner he'd found on the workbench. The air was thick with tension and the faint smell of scorched metal from their last failed escape. Lila paced nearby, her blue skin glowing softly, silver hair swaying with each step. The sparks around her hands had faded, but her yellow eyes burned with restless energy. We're wasting time, she said, stopping to glare at the sealed hatch. He's out there laughing at us. Jackson didn't look up, his fingers prying at the scanner's wires. He's not laughing if we get out. Just need to figure this place out. He'd flown through asteroid fields and dodged bounty hunters, but being stuck in a locked box with a sparking alien was new. Lila crossed her arms, her glow flickering. You think too much like a pilot. Fly in, fly out. This isn't a ship you can steer. He grinned, glancing at her. Maybe not. But every trap's got a weak spot. We just haven't found it yet. Before she could argue, a low rumble shook the fortress. Dust trickled from the ceiling, and the slits showed a red haze swallowing the moons. What now? Jackson muttered, standing as the rumble grew into a roar. Lila's eyes widened. Sandstorm. A big one. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the drifter, still parked in the fortress's open bay. We need cover, now. They barely made it inside the ship's cramped cockpit before the storm slammed into the walls, a howling wall of sand and wind that rattled the hull. Jackson sealed the hatch, the cockpit's dim lights flickering as the storm raged outside. Well, this is cozy, he said, squeezing into the pilot's seat. Lila stood beside him, too close in the tight space, her warmth brushing against his side. Cozy's one word for it, she replied, peering out the viewport. The sand blasted against the glass, turning the world into a red blur. These storms can last hours. Sometimes days. Jackson leaned back, hands behind his head. Great. More quality time with my new partner in trouble. She shot him a look, but there was a hint of a smile. You're not as funny as you think. He chuckled. You're not as scary as you think. For a moment, they just watched the storm, the cockpit humming softly around them. Then Lila spoke, quieter. I've seen storms like this my whole life. Trapped inside, watching the world tear itself apart. I always wanted to be out there, free. Jackson turned to her, curious. Free to do what? She hesitated, her glow softening. Anything. See the stars. Live without someone deciding my fate. He nodded, understanding more than he expected. I get that. Been flying solo for years, dodging rules and debts. Freedom's why I keep the drifter running. Lila studied him, her yellow eyes searching. Then why chase credits? Why not just fly? Jackson shrugged, looking at the storm. Freedom's not free. Fuel, repairs, food, it all costs. Thought this job would keep me going. Didn't plan on this. He gestured vaguely at her, the fortress, the mess they were in. Lila sat on the edge of the co-pilot's seat, her silver hair catching the cockpit's light. Neither did I. But here we are. The storm's roar filled the silence, and Jackson felt the weight of her words. They were stuck, sure, but maybe not alone. All right, he said, pulling the scanner into his lap. Let's use the time. Help me fix this, might pick up something useful. She raised an eyebrow. You trust me with your ship? He smirked. You trusted me with your sparks. Fair's fair. She slid closer, her hands steady as she worked the scanner's circuits. Jackson watched her, impressed. Where'd you learn this? He asked. Father's junk, she said, not looking up. He hoarded tech, old ships, drones, anything he could trade. I'd sneak in, take things apart, put them back better. Kept me sane. Jackson whistled low. Not just a spark thrower, huh? You're a mechanic too. She smirked. And you're not just a debt chaser. You're stubborn. Most humans would have given up by now. Stubborn's my best trick, he said, their hands brushing as they rewired the scanner. A jolt ran through him, not from her sparks, but something else. He ignored it, focusing on the task. Minutes turned to hours, the storm a constant roar outside. The scanner beeped to life, its screen flickering with static. Got it, Jackson said, adjusting the signal. A faint voice crackled through, garbled, but there. Containment, secure, power source, then it cut out. Lila frowned. Power source. That's me, isn't it? He's hiding me because of this. She lifted a hand, sparks flaring briefly. Jackson leaned forward, piecing it together. Maybe. Or maybe it's bigger. That didn't sound like Vorm, it sounded official. Galactic. Her glow dimmed, her face tightening. If they're after me, we're in more trouble than I thought. Jackson met her gaze, steady. Then we'd better get out before they get in. The storm began to ease, the red haze thinning outside. Jackson stood, stretching. Ship's intakes are clogged from this mess. Help me clear them? Lila nodded, rising with him. Only if you stop calling me trouble. He grinned. No promises. They stepped outside, the air still thick with dust, and worked side by side, him digging sand from the engines, her using her sparks to melt stubborn clumps. It was hard, sweaty work, but they moved like a team, no words needed. As the suns peeked through the fading storm, Jackson wiped his brow and looked at Lila. She was tough, smart, and fighting for something bigger than herself. He didn't know what yet, but he was starting to want to find out. We're not done, she said, catching his stare. Not even close, he agreed. The fortress loomed behind them, its secrets still locked tight. But now, they weren't just trapped, they were allies, ready to face whatever came next. The twin suns of Calthor rose over the horizon, bathing the desert in a harsh golden light. Jackson Teller stood beside the drifter, his hands black with engine grease, watching the last wisps of the sandstorm fade into the distance. The ship's intakes were clear, thanks to Lila's help, and the hum of its systems was a small victory in their prison of a fortress. Lila crouched nearby, her blue skin shimmering as she scanned the horizon with those sharp yellow eyes. We've got a shot now, she said, standing and brushing sand from her hands. The storm's gone. Let's break out. Jackson nodded, wiping his brow. Agreed. But Vorm's tech is tough. We need more than sparks and a scanner. He glanced at the fortress walls, still sealed tight after their last attempt. Lila's glow flickered, a sign of her frustration. There's a backup generator in the bay, she said, pointing to a hulking machine half buried in the sand. Father used it to power his traps. If we overload it, it might crash the whole system. Overload it how? Jackson asked, already moving toward the generator. It was a mess of rusted metal and tangled wires, but he could see the faint glow of energy inside. Lila followed, her silver hair glinting in the sunlight. With me, she said simply, raising a hand. Sparks danced around her fingers, brighter now, like tiny bolts of lightning. Jackson grinned despite the odds. You're full of surprises. All right, let's fry it. They worked fast. Jackson ripped open the generator's casing, exposing its core, a pulsing orb of light that hummed with power. Lila knelt beside him, her hands steady as she channeled her sparks into the wires he pointed out. Careful, he warned, watching the energy surge. Don't want to blow us up instead. She smirked. Trust me, human. I've got this. The generator groaned, smoke curling from its seams as the sparks flowed in. Then, with a loud crack, the orb flared white-hot and died. A shudder ran through the fortress, and the metal hatch clanked open. Yes. Jackson pumped a fist, turning to Lila. Told you we'd find the weak spot. She stood, her glow steady now. We're not free yet. Father's got friends, bad ones. They'll come. As if on cue, a low rumble echoed across the desert. Jackson spun, spotting 3 sleek ships cresting the dunes, their hulls marked with jagged red symbols. Friends, huh, he said, sprinting for the drifter. Time to fly. Lila raced after him, leaping into the co-pilot's seat as he fired up the engines. The ship roared to life, lifting off just as the enemy ships opened fire. Blue energy bolts streaked past, scorching the sand below. Jackson yanked the controls, dodging the blasts with a pilot's instinct. Hold on, he shouted, banking hard. Lila gripped the console, her hands sparking. Can I shoot back? He grinned. Thought you'd never ask. Weapons are yours. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers danced over the controls, linking her energy to the ship's cannons. The first shot wasn't normal. A burst of blue fire erupted from the drifter, slamming into an enemy ship. It spun out, crashing in a plume of dust. "Whoa," Jackson said, eyes wide. "What was that?" Lila's grin was fierce. "Me. Told you I'm worth more than credits." He laughed, pulling the ship into a climb. No argument here. The remaining ships closed in, their fire relentless. Jackson weaved through the barrage, the cockpit shaking with each near miss. "They're good," he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Too good." Lila's glow brightened as she fired again, taking out another ship in a blaze of sparks. "They're mercenaries," she said, her voice tight. "Father hires them to keep his secrets safe." Jackson glanced at her. "Secrets like you?" She didn't answer, her focus on the last ship tailing them. It was fast, matching their every move. Jackson pushed the drifter to its limit, the engines screaming as he dove toward a narrow canyon in the dunes. "Hang on, this is gonna be tight." The walls rushed past, inches from the hull, but the mercenary followed, firing wildly. Lila twisted in her seat. "I've got an idea. Get me close." Jackson didn't question her, pulling up sharply to loop behind the enemy. "Now," he yelled. Lila leaned forward, her hands glowing like stars. She unleashed a wave of energy, not at the ship, but at the canyon walls. Sand and rock exploded, collapsing the passage in a roaring avalanche. The mercenary ship couldn't dodge in time, it smashed into the debris, vanishing in a cloud of dust. Jackson let out a whoop, leveling the drifter above the chaos. "That's my girl," he said, then caught himself, glancing at her. Lila raised an eyebrow, but her lips curved. "Your girl, huh? Don't get used to it." The desert stretched out below, quiet now, the fortress a shrinking speck behind them. Jackson set the ship on a steady course, catching his breath. "We're out. What's next?" Lila stared out the viewport, her glow fading to a soft shimmer. "Father's not done. Those mercenaries weren't just his, they're part of something bigger. I heard them talking once, about a council. They want me for something." Jackson frowned, the pieces not quite fitting. "A council? What do they want with a spark-throwing runaway?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice low. "But I'm tired of being a prize. I want answers, and freedom." Jackson leaned back, meeting her gaze. "Then we'll find them. Together. I'm not letting some shadowy council, or your crazy dad, call the shots." She studied him, surprised by the steel in his voice. "Why help me? You don't owe me anything." He shrugged, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe I like the company. Or maybe I just hate losing." The stars winked into view as the drifter climbed higher, leaving Calthor behind. The fight had been close, but they'd won, for now. Jackson didn't know what Lila's powers meant, or why a council might want her, but he knew one thing, they weren't running blind anymore. They were a team, forged in sand and fire, and whatever came next, they'd face it head-on. The galaxy was wide open, and their story was just getting started.